Hi, my name is Brandon Parsons, and I manage American River's floodplain restoration work for the Puget Sound and Columbia River basins. Today, I'm excited to talk to you about the economic impacts of floodplain restoration on property values and community revenues. This project was originally developed for the Puget Sound, but has broad applicability across the country. As we all know, rivers crisscross our nation, and many of our communities have grown up around them because they provide clean water and vital resources. There's no wonder that 92% of major US cities have rivers running through them. So at American Rivers, we are concerned with protecting wild rivers, restoring damaged rivers, and conserving clean waters for those communities across the country. So when we're looking at a river, we're not just looking at the single thread channel itself. It's much broader than that. We like to take more of a watershed view of river health. And associated with that are the floodplains. And these are the broad, flat areas along a river that become inundated during periods of flood. And they provide vital aquatic and community benefits. So a few of those benefits are things like storing floodwaters, which can help protect property adjacent to those floodplains. So it stores that water and then re-releases it. That can also help to clean the water because it filters it through the vegetation and the soil. When it floods, it also deposits rich sediments onto the ground that can aid agriculture or other types of industries, as well as support aquatic and terrestrial life. Floodplains also store groundwater and provide some recreational opportunities, specifically when they're not flooded, more of which we'll discuss later on. So the history of floodplains and floodplain development in our country is somewhat consistent. So when European settlers came in, the majority of our rivers and floodplain were more natural. As settlement occurred, a lot of the forests around the floodplains and around our rivers were cleared, and those raw materials were transported downstream and made way for agriculture. As part of that, both of our land and our rivers began to be augmented. To support those new resources that were coming out, industry came in afterwards and usually settled along rivers or along ocean fronts and estuaries and began to process those materials and transport them elsewhere. With industry came jobs, and development began to expand throughout the floodplain. So to support or to protect those emerging industries and those emerging communities that were growing up in the floodplain, new flood protection measures came online throughout the 20th century, and now we're left with the situation we have today. A lot of our rivers have been straightened, they've been levied to protect the businesses and residences behind it, because our floodplains now provide substantial tax base to these communities. In King County alone, 65,000 jobs are located in the floodplain, and that supports like 7% of our overall economy. So these areas are really important, and they were protected over time, and they consist now of a variety of uses, including industrial, commercial, and residential developments. So this is what a natural floodplain looks like, at least in our area. This is another example of a floodplain just outside of Seattle that is not natural. It's been heavily modified. You can see that it's a single thread channel. It doesn't have any of the complexity of the previous image. And then of course, development has come in behind it. And this is typical of a lot of urban rivers where that complexity and that broad floodplain has been cut off, and you're left with a single thread channel that's not only hard to access, but can also be somewhat of a flood risk when large storms come. So when I like to think about how we developed, I like to think back to the wise philosopher, Jeff Goldblum, who said, "We were so preoccupied with whether or not we could that we didn't stop to think about if we should." I do think this applies well to what we're talking about here today, because the folks that originally put forward these levees or disconnected their floodplains, they weren't trying to do anything bad. They were trying to help their communities. They were trying to increase sediment transport. They were trying to protect their communities and grow their economies. And honestly, they didn't really take a step back to realize the underlying repercussions of those actions. And they didn't have the information that we have today to really understand the natural and beneficial functions that those floodplain areas provide. So despite having 400 miles of levees throughout our region, flooding remains one of our largest and most costly natural disasters. So we have had 15 major disasters since 1990. We still have over 100,000 structures in the floodplain, resulting in over $1 billion in damage over the last 30 years. While this is a consistent problem that we have, it's not unique to us. These numbers are dwarfed by the numbers in the Mississippi, in the Midwest, and in the East Coast. So we understand this is an issue throughout the country and part of why we are all here today. But up in the Northwest, we have endangered species, which adds another layer of complexity. So our Chinook salmon, king salmon, populations have declined by 93%, largely due to habitat loss. As you can see, the majority of our riparian forests were cleared at the beginning of the 20th century, and only about half of our floodplains remain. And of that half, the majority of them are in poor condition. So it's no wonder that these iconic species are declining. And as a result, so are the predators that rely on them. So southern resident orca whales are also listed as endangered, and Chinook salmon are their primary food source. So when we're talking about floodplain restoration, what are we actually talking about? In this context, floodplain restoration refers to returning the connectivity between the river channel and the floodplain so that water can access the floodplain at the right time, volume, and frequency to support ecological processes at the appropriate scale. So we want that water out on the floodplain at the right time and at a scale that's conducive to that system. In this case, especially in the urban context, we're also talking about converting land uses that are conducive to or benefited by regular inundation, transforming a unit of risk into a unit of natural capital. This includes things like buying out repetitive lost properties and replacing them with open space so that that land is more conducive to flooding, and that can actually benefit properties adjacent to that new open space area, providing additional natural capital. This is an example of floodplain restoration project. It's a levee removal in Washington. And floodplain restoration can take a variety of forms. It could be reconnecting the floodplain through levee setbacks or levee removals like this, or it could be doing riparian vegetation or preservation of the floodplain, et cetera, a variety of different things. So project need, what are we doing now? We understand that healthy floodplains are vital to our community and our ecosystem, but the existing tax base makes it hard to actually do meaningful restoration, specifically in the urban environment. As you can see in the picture here, there's a variety of different uses in the floodplain, and an argument that we hear often up here is that restoration is not conducive to economic growth. Restoration and conservation can actually inhibit economic growth because that land is no longer able to be utilized. And we often hear that we're not going to lose a single business to the river. And that's just not the full story, and part of why we're here today and what some of our findings help support. So number three, we need to justify and quantify the return that we're getting on our restoration programs. So there's been billions of dollars invested in restoration and billions more invested in flood protection. We need to better understand the economic impacts of that investment so we can be more competitive with limited funding moving forward. So put another way, what we are here to do is understand how restoration impacts revenue. We know that revenue funds restoration, but what we're trying to determine is how restoration impacts revenue and what are some of the economic benefits associated with that. So the details of the project, This is phase one of a multi-phase project, and it's really to establish the proof of concept. We've gone through the history of floodplain development, but we also conducted a national and regional literature review to understand what types of benefits communities had received from floodplain restoration and which benefits had actually been quantified. So we did an exhaustive literature review to look at that. We also conducted 9 informational interviews with floodplain experts and practitioners across the country, many of which are part of ASFPM or leadership. But they also include people like realtors, people like developers, city council members, politicians, planners, etc. And the goal of this is really to document what type of restoration occurred and the economic outcomes of that restoration so we can inform future designs. We want to know what we need to do in the future to make better projects for the environment, our communities, and grow our economies. So I won't get into all of the project criteria, but the main takeaway is that we looked at sites that actually incorporated what we consider to be actual floodplain restoration that meets our definition. There's been a lot of riverfront and oceanfront development over the years that might have an ecologic component. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about true restoration that spurs new ecologic function and supports kind of the process, the ecological processes that rely on floodplain connectivity and quantifying what those economic outcomes have been. So out of the literature, we found a variety of case studies across the country and a couple one in Canada and one in Europe. And what we found was that the economic outcomes from restoration can be split up into 6 broad categories. So first, floodplain restoration can reduce flood risk, can increase property value, it can add valuable development outside of the floodplain, it can increase tax revenue, often from that development or from visitation to that area. It can increase and add new jobs and economic activity, and it can also attract new businesses and employees to this area. So reduce flood risk. We all know that flooding is our most costly natural disaster here in the country, and it's only increasing with climate change. And with that, we need to both improve the security of our cities and our communities to prevent further loss of life or property damage. But we also need to improve our financial security. We cannot continue to spend billions of dollars every year on flood restoration or disaster recovery. So we have to do better about that and plan more appropriately. And by doing that, we can actually reduce our flood insurance rates, saving us money, and save money in the long term, because it's been estimated that for every dollar invested in pre-disaster mitigation, $6 are found and result in avoided damages. So for every dollar invested, that equals $6 in avoided damages just by investing early and going through the appropriate planning. So examples that we found in the literature are, first off, Waterbury, Vermont. They experienced a 20% reduction in flood damage from their restoration projects. Portland, Oregon did an acquisition program and restoration program on Johnson Creek, resulting in $30 million in avoided damages over the next 100 years. In Tucson, $69 million on the Santa Cruz River in avoided damages. In Napa, California, a great project that was spurred by the Army Corps and the need for flood protection, but also incorporated some incredible restoration and has really transformed that city, resulting in $1 billion in avoided damages and a lot of development outside of the floodplain after that restoration took place. So increased property value. Rivers are often the largest community amenity. So here in Fort Worth, our neighbor Dallas next door is going through an amazing restoration and enhancement project along the Trinity River. They're restoring and improving the Trinity to make this incredible community amenity right in the heart of the city. And with that, property values adjacent to that new development or that new restoration project are going to go up, and new development is going to be spurred by that project. So a few numbers here. 150 million are going to be invested in the Trinity River, resulting in 2.5 billion in new real estate development. And that's going to result in 1.2 billion in new property tax revenue. So this, again, is a huge project with also huge economic returns on that investment, and really a transformative project for that city, all based around the river and the new healthy floodplain. So other examples include Denver, Colorado saw a 36% increase when they invested in restoring and improving the South Platte. Santa Cruz, California, 3 to 13% increase in property values. Portland, 10%, and Muskegon, 12 million in increased value. And this can aid existing properties, like who doesn't want their property value to go up? So it can aid existing properties, but again, it can also spur new development and new tax bases that can then be used to support essential services and additional restoration. So we talked about this a little bit already, but value add development, you improve an area, new development comes in and benefits from that restoration effort. But it's not just improving that area. So it could also be preserving what you have and encouraging new development outside of the floodplain to take advantage or be aided in some way by that existing natural area. Because as we know, it's a lot cheaper to save something and preserve something than it is to rebuild it. So this there's an economic value to preserving what you have and restoring what you've lost. Excuse me. And what we observe from the literature is that the impacts of this are most pronounced when you incorporate multiple benefits. When you incorporate flood risk reduction and overlay recreational amenities. A few examples. Denver, Colorado, again, has seen $10 billion in new development coming after restoring the South Platte. Cleveland, Ohio, $1 billion in new development along the Cuyahoga. Buffalo, 428 million, and Peoria, almost 2 million in new development annually. And that spurs increased tax revenue, as we already mentioned. Property and sales use tax are the largest sources of revenue for a lot of communities. So when a project takes place, when you embark on this incredible effort, like in the case of Dallas, $150 million investment, that brings a lot of jobs to your area. So there's an initial influx in revenue from that construction spending, purchase of materials, accommodation for those workers, and additional spending that takes place in that area. But that can be a small and temporary boost in the economy when compared to the long-term impacts of developing a sustainable amenity for your community. So once a river is clean, people want to be there, right? So people will come to that area. There'll be more visitor spending. There'll be more development. There'll be increased recreation or events that provides more tax revenue and more spending in that area, boosting your overall economy. And with that additional revenue, you can create new taxing structures to support your essential services, but also to support continuing restoration. So from Denver, they obtained, they obtained 64 million in new property tax revenues annually. Santa Cruz again, 240 per property. Toronto, they're expecting over 373 million in new property tax revenue from the Don River restoration. And the Theophos Waterway here in Washington saw a 2-to-1 return on their initial investment. And this helped to fund, or again, this tax revenue can help to fund, incredible programs. So in Iowa State, the Flood Mitigation Board relies in part on an incremental sales tax to fund mitigation projects. And as of 2015, the program had raised nearly $600 million for flood reduction projects. Ballot measure AA in the San Francisco Bay Area, they established a $1 a month parcel tax that will raise $500 million over the next 20 years for climate resiliency. In Long Island, since 1998, they imposed a 2% tax on new real estate transactions, which has directed over $1 billion to open space preservation and overall coastal resilience. So again, if you're restoring an area and it's boosting new development and it's boosting your tax base, then new taxing structures can be established based on that new revenue stream to continue to support that economic engine. New jobs and economic activity, we've gone over this a little bit, but when you restore an area, people want to be there, and that has a multiplying effect. So for every job added, there's additional jobs supported by that spending. So in Washington, for every one environmental job added, you're supporting 0.6 other jobs. So there's a real tangible benefit there that can be observed. So for every $1 million spent on a project, that results in $1 million in economic activity, totaling $2 million in the overall community benefit. So examples of this are in Napa, California. Again, they restored that area, provided flood protection. That resulted in over 1,200 new permanent jobs in development adjacent to that floodplain. Toronto, interesting metric that they used, but over 10,000 years of employment. King County, Washington, 24 full-time jobs supported by just one project. And the Theophos Waterway, again, supported 0.7 jobs for every job that was created through that project. Now, we also have business and employee attraction. So, hit one more time, people they want to be by the water. So businesses choose to locate to areas with high quality of life. An example here is of New Belgium Brewery relocating to Asheville, North Carolina, and their new facility supports 135 new jobs. So that also helps them attract top talent, and it's something we see in industries across the country. Top talent wants to live in a nice place. So if you are invested in your greatest natural resource, you can attract top talent and again grow your business. And what we saw in the literature in a new study out of Bend, Oregon, shows that businesses that invested in the quality of life experience resulted in higher wage growth, and they were also more resilient to the 2008 recession. So the key findings and lessons learned. Number one, restoring floodplains and promoting economic activity are not mutually exclusive. That is so important to understand that argument that we're not going to lose a single business to the river is not valid. Restoring sections of the river results in the highest and best use adjacent to that river and can support your economy and grow your tax base. So as rivers are cleaned, people want to use them to live, work, and play. Again, through the multiplier effect, that supports more jobs. Successful urban restoration is designed to improve local ecosystems, reduce flood risk, and improve quality of life. You have to have multiple benefits to realize the maximum economic returns on your project. So when planned appropriately, floodplain restoration outweighs the cost, yielding positive net impacts on local and state budgets. This is an important one to remember too, and this is kind of the crux of our whole argument here, is that we're really impacting local and state budgets. These are real tangible numbers that policymakers, legislators, and planners can look at and quantify and wrap their head around. There's been a lot of work on ecosystem services, but this is different. This is hard numbers that show up on people's books. Number 5, floodplain restoration can be another tool for city planners and developers as they make land use decisions. So now that we know that our rivers can be an economic driver for our communities, we can actually incorporate them into our comp plans, we can incorporate them into our land use decisions, we can make sure that that economic resource and economic engine is protected so we can continue to grow our communities and our economies responsibly. And overarchingly, I have to discuss safety. because you have to have safety initially when you're restoring an area, you're providing flood risk reduction, etc. But you have to provide safety throughout the life of the project. If you don't maintain it and there's illicit activity going on there, or it feels unsafe for people and they don't want to visit, you're not going to have the economic returns. So safety needs to be included throughout your project life cycle. So we started out trying to answer the question, how does restoration impact revenue? We knew that revenue funds restoration. What we now know is that restoration can increase revenue, thereby creating a sustainable cycle where if you invest in restoration, you can continue to support the essential services of your communities and also support that economic engine of restoration to continue to bring in more revenue for your community and grow your overall tax base. So, in summary, restoration supports revenue. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jonathon Kusa. I am with Inter-Fluve. We are a stream restoration firm spread across the US with approximately 50 employees, working from Maine to Canada to Oregon and a lot of places in between. We focus primarily on aquatic systems restoration, in particular stream and river systems, but we do work all the way down into estuaries and other interesting places. Today, I'm here representing Marty Melcher and a broader team of staff that have been working on projects in Milwaukee, specifically looking at the renaturalization of concrete-lined urban river systems. So with that, we'll get going. We're going to start with a quick outline of what we're talking about with a brief history of the projects and the project examples that we've looked at, talking about some of the site constraints, design considerations, and outlook. As you see on the right side of your screen, that is one of our quintessential urban river channels. This is the LA River. As you note, it's excellent for car chases and movie scenes, but has very little ecological value to it. One of the interesting things going on right now is that the city of Los Angeles and other partners are looking at renaturalizing the Los Angeles River, and they're looking at templates. And one of the templates that we have proposed is the most applicable and has been already looked at is the work that's been done in Milwaukee. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the Kinnickinnic River. So Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District is our primary client. Since about 2000, they have spent in excess of about $60 million removing concrete channels. The channel we're looking at is, as it's noticed here, formerly low to moderate gradient meandering river, with channelization beginning in the 1800s as development occurred and continuing all the way through the 1980s. Channels were lined with concrete from about 65 until about 1985. And so they've started to exceed their design life. I'm not sure whether 20 plus years, but they definitely are in excess of what the anticipated design life was for those channels. And obviously with the concrete, they've very little to no habitat value. So MMSD has been looking, like I say, at projects since 2000. Here's a long list of projects that they have implemented, many of which we have been a part of. And so as an example, we've got Lincoln Creek there in 2000, and then 15 years after reconstruction, you can see it still is functioning as intended with a lot more ecology and sustainable design being integrated into the application. So let's look specifically at the Underwood Phase 2 project. Here is the channel as it was prior to construction in 2015. Project location is essentially here within the city of Milwaukee. Menominee River is at the top right of your screen flowing towards the lake, and you've got the Underwood Creek flowing in kind of this arc around the county grounds here, and the CP rails on one side, Fisher Parkway bounds it on the north side. You got Highway 45 crossing it. Tight urban constraint. So Underwood Phase 1 here was above the highway, and then Underwood Phase 2 was below the highway. One of the key elements here is that The county flood grounds project has that dashed green line in it, was a diversion that reduces the 100-year event by about 50% or about 3,000 CFS. And so for an urban design channel, it is helpful to trim off the peak of the hydrograph so that you're not dealing with this high of a shear stress within those systems as was currently being experienced by the channel, which allows us to use a more naturalized material within that channel as we design it. So looking at the channel specifically, one of the things we start with as designers is looking at performance criteria. Those criteria are critical for determining what is the most appropriate application within the context of that system. These are not cookie cutter projects by any means, and so we want to look at each system in its unique form and understand what that system needs to accomplish and accommodate relative to the context of the site. So obviously water conveyance is a main issue, getting water from point A to point B. Then we've got some more ecological focused issues, including northern pike passage to an area upstream of about 140 acres of spawning habitat. You got wetlands and riparian floodplains. You get in-stream habitat complexity. Obviously from the picture here, you can see it's your standard trapezoidal channel with your paved floodplain. Not a lot of habitat complexity there. It is in an urban area, and so looking for some natural aesthetics as a part of the project is important. And then MMSD, like every other partner out there, is looking at how do they minimize long-term maintenance, and so having some long-term stability that's going to reduce the maintenance needed for this site is a critical element of those performance criteria. And finally, improving public safety. This system right now is, water inherently draws people to it. If you're going to draw people to water in urban spaces, let's make sure that that water is accessible and as safe as it possibly can be within the area that we have got available to us to work. So a little bit of history here. Lower portion of the Underwood Creek was completely cut off and diverted into a channelized concrete line reach between 1963 and 1967. Between 1967 and 1970, an additional upstream mile of the stream had been channelized and lined. And between 70 and 75, the old channel had been filled by the golf course south of the railroad tracks. And so you can see, again, heavily impacted by urban development over the course of its known life. So in 2011, MMSD began the restoration of the phase 1 of the county grounds, as I mentioned, that bypass. And then in 2016, we began the design of phase 2. Corps of Engineers funds under the Section 506 of the Water Resources Act supported that work. And then in 2017 and 2018, we began construction of the phase 2. As we note here, the county grounds flood management project did create a need for compensatory wetland mitigation, which was satisfied through phase 1 and phase 2 projects. So some of the project roles here, it's always important to know who you're working with on these projects. And so we have a broad team here that we worked with, including MMSD, Army Corps of Engineers, and then ESM did some planting plan work on these. The project constraints, as we noted, we've got CP rail bridge both north as well as in the residential streets, Highway 45 crossing. We have various drop structures, railroad crossing, allow standard urban constraints within the project system. One of the things, obviously, not obviously, but one of the things we look at as part of our projects at Inter-Fluve is looking at fish passage. And so the Underwood Creek system, as I mentioned, does have northern pike that migrate through it, and those fish have a certain criteria that the water needs to meet to allow them to manage their migration. So we looked at depth of flow, try to maintain greater than 6 inches, try to maintain velocity under 4 feet per second, and provide resting habitat. The velocities do exceed the targets in some of the concrete areas by the railroad, but those areas are seem short enough that the fish using their burst speeds can get through there. We also had adult 20+ inch brown trout observed during the 10 CFS condition in October 2018, but those are much stronger swimmers. And so, as is typical for all of our projects, we typically look at the weakest swimmer of the bunch that might be trying to manage the particular channel, and are trying to design for that. So the analog systems that were considered have similar slopes, as many of you practitioners understand. Is you want to look at similar systems while recognizing that there's no such thing as a true reference that you can replicate from one channel to the next, due to the changes, or the differences, I should say, in land use and the local constraints on a particular project reach. And so it is useful to look at analogs, in this case, looking at similar sloped analogs with similar channel morphology, but understanding that those need to be adjusted and amended to accommodate the unique flow conditions, site constraints, recreational needs, et cetera, of the particular channel. So narrow valley, limited amplitude and floodplain space, you can see that in here, low sinuosity, flashy flows, and then what we say is a transport reach. That means that the sediment is moving through the reach rather than depositing within it. And those are all the elements that we were trying to and would want to replicate within our system at Underwood Creek. So we go out there and you take a look, and you actually conduct some field measurements. You look at the terrestrial area of the project that's sometimes aquatic, and then the aquatic area that is going to maintain the flows of the system and base flows. You can see the large boulders within that system for creating pocket pools and resting areas, and then the smaller material spread throughout there, as well as then material going up on the side slopes that is managing the higher flows as the flows encroach on the floodplain. So based on that, we develop our project sections. This is what we call an immobile boundary channel. So within urban areas, you don't want your channel boundary, i.e. your edge of your channel, to be mobile, i.e. moving into other areas. And so in this case, with the railroad and residential streets and development, you just unfortunately cannot accommodate natural stream process here as you would in an open setting that has no site constraints and no issues with the stream accessing other areas. So for this, we had an immobile boundary channel, which means the rock has to be a certain size and certain constraints are placed on the stream that you manage the energy of the stream system with materials. The meander within a limited belt width, so in other words, the sinuosity of the stream is limited by the width that we've got available to us, frankly, within the constraints. You've got constrained wall segments. There's also floodplain bench wetlands. And so we essentially can put in some variable width wetlands that will create floodplain accessible areas. Back to that mitigation I mentioned earlier, it benefits us to achieve those mitigation goals, as well as provide habitat within the riparian corridor. And then, as I mentioned, there's limited sediment supply, there's small gravel sand, and this is a transport reach, so we're going to move that material right through our system. The Corps of Engineers based their CAD sketches on our Inter-Fluve work. You'll see here that they had some riffle pool segments that are shown on the channel with anywhere from 1.5 to 0.25% grades. And then there's some tree islands that were placed in the floodplains, as well as then maintaining a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 valley side slope, which is pretty darn steep. But as you can see here, you've got the West Fisher Parkway and the property line, and then the project on one side, and then the CP rail, the property line on the south side. A lot of this work is done in the field after we do the initial drawing. So this here is the planting plan with the sedge meadows and the native shrubs and trees. Again, no mow maintenance was the plan, and still is the plan, on the valley side slopes to minimize how much effort has to be put in to maintain the channel. And so the design inherently accommodates the long-term vegetation growth of the system in a way that accommodates what is going to happen over the next 50 years without MMSD having to go in there and actively maintain it. Like I say, a lot of these designs require field fit of whether it be boulders for pocket pools or in this case, the vegetation. And so we frequently are looking at our design models, the hydraulic model, and assessing how that may or may not be impacted by placement of materials to ensure that we're not creating greater roughness and increasing propensity for the system to flood into adjacent areas by creating unintentional increases in roughness through the project site. So let's look at a little bit of the project construction photos. These are always fun. Drove in some sheet pile, the base of the Highway 45 bridge. Then the concrete was perforated with that excavator you can see there in the photo. Well, excuse me, that's the next picture. I'm looking already ahead. The dewatering was done for up to a ½ inch of rain and was contained via pumping up to about 4,000 linear feet past the channel project site. And then we had constant monitoring of that pumping system. Here's the channel construction that I mentioned with the perforations of the channel base. And then we broke that up, and then that was used as a base road and hauled away. It was not reused as channel stone. Channel construction lasted about 6 months. We, as I mentioned, hauled a lot of concrete out of there. The channel stone was, some people consider reusing the concrete to create the channel stone within the system, but our determination and preference is to utilize natural stone where possible, and to not the concrete functionally would work, but from an aesthetic and safety perspective was not desired. So as I mentioned, this is an immobile channel boundary. We typically don't like to see the entire channel cased in rock as you see here, but in this case that was the requirement based on the limited space that we had available within the channel. And so you'll see here the subgrade excavation, channel stone being placed, the microbathymetry and the boulder placement that I mentioned that was represented in the plan sets in rough form is going to happen here after we do the single pass. So the channel's used as a haul route, and then you're working your way backwards out of the channel as you build it out. So here's the subgrade excavation. As I mentioned, the microbathymetry and boulder placement. The excavator here is placing those larger materials within the channel system. You can see the same large boulders that we saw in that natural system. And Michael's is working on placing those boulders and then digging out the pocket pools as they work their way back out of the channel. Let's see here. You can see the drop structure. This is a 2015. The bridge is on your left. Drop structure is right in front of you. And then here is in 2018, that same area with the stream running through the stone channel. And the vegetation is just starting to come in, as you can tell. This is one of the first season that we had growth here. You'll see here in 2019 already that we've got a lot denser vegetation. We got vegetation that's accessible to the channel. So let's say if you're an amphibious, let's say you're a turtle or a frog, your access between the terrestrial and the aquatic is obviously available to you. You've got habitat space. Water is, for us and a lot of other creatures, most other creatures, a key ingredient for life. And so making sure that the natural ecosystem can function to the best of its ability within this urban environment by allowing close connectivity between the terrestrial and the aquatic environment is critical. Key elements that we were concerned about are that this has seen several bank floods since construction. The water levels have correlated well with our hydraulic models. We're happy to see that. And then the channel is moving the small gravel as we designed it to transport that through the material or through the project reach. And then we have seen cyprinids and salmonids migrating through. And most importantly, we've got some happy neighbors next to the site because from a functionality standpoint, it's working to move and mitigate flood flows, but from an aesthetic and ecological standpoint, it's far enhanced from where it was before with the concrete line system that was in place. So here's a slightly steeper area. You can see the transition from a kind of a 1% slope to 1.5% slope on the foreground to the background there. But you can see, well, I should note that the lake run brown trout, we're loving this. They're migrating into the low flow immediately following water release, which was lovely to see. Another project area that we worked on was this Pulaski Park. Pulaski Park is the second phase, as I note here, of a multi-phase project to naturalize the concrete line Kinnickinnic River. You can see the concrete line in the foreground discharging into the naturalized system. And so one of the things we looked at here is, and this is true for all urban projects, is that you can't always achieve your naturalized system in all locations. We've got urban constraints, including the bridge infrastructure in particular, that limits our ability to naturalize all areas. So this is the area that was designed with retaining walls. Shear stresses are in excess of 15 pounds per square foot through here. And so there's just no viable way to maintain a naturalized vegetated system in this location. And recognizing that's important as a designer so that you can understand the appropriate balance between hardscape and more native softscape, we'll call it. I want to recognize quite a few people here that were a part of this, both from MMSD, Corps of Engineers. Grafe was our, I forgot to mention them, I apologize. Grafe was our prime on the project. And then, as I mentioned, ESM, Rose Cheminsky, and then Benyar was the LA and helped us with the design. And then we've got a large Inter-Fluve team that has been working on these projects over the course of a number of years. And so with that, I also wanted to show kind of a little fly-through of the video here that I thought might be interesting. This was prepared by MMSD and is a good overview of the project. And so with the time remaining, I'm going to just let this run here for a minute, and it's going to replicate a little bit of what we saw, but this is the phase 2 section. As you all know, the drone videos that we've got now provide a great tool for review of the project sites. And so this was a video produced by MMSD on behalf of the channel. And you can see here, it's got a lot of good evidence of, well, you can see the trees actually growing into the concrete there, but you can see the concrete system was at a failing point. Here's the diversion structure with the pumping system. It was pumping that half-inch rainfall around the project site. If it exceeded that, it frankly had to just go right through the project. So we got about 4,000 linear feet of, we call it concrete stream. It's a term for concrete channel. And then we've got, during construction here, the low flows. And then this is after flow was released into the system. And you can see some of the vegetation already coming up through the first summer or year and a half of growth that occurred. On the right, you can see the fabric encapsulated lifts. We basically put the soil that is going to be impacted by potential flows in the water in these fabric encapsulated lifts to provide them some stability, while then to the right you can see the green there while it grows in with vegetation. So the intent is to bridge the gap between when there is no vegetation and when the vegetation takes hold and provides the stability to those naturalized areas that they will naturally have. So you can see progression here for the vegetation through the project site as the project evolved. You can see the project cost here on the bottom of the screen. We want to thank our federal partners always for providing support of these type of projects. Here you can see the much tighter constrained corridor, parking lot on your left, railroad on your right. We've got sheet pile retaining walls that were used to create that floodplain bench. In essence, trying to concentrate the flows and the shear stresses within the channel, within the rock line section of the channel. And then we can provide a lighter touch, so to speak, in those wetland floodplain benches on those upper areas so that you can get green vegetation adjacent to the stream. Now here, you don't have that riparian connection that I mentioned that's so important for our amphibious friends and a lot of other creatures, frankly. And so again, urban projects, you've got to be realistic about what you can achieve. Obviously, you're not able to allow a turtle access to the stream from that perched riparian bench. And so there are obviously ecological limitations that have to be recognized and are just a natural part of the condition when you're working within an urban environment. So, but overall, you know, the project where it did enhance and uplift ecology. You can see here with the flyover that we, even within a tight space, were able to achieve a lot of connectivity between the stream or the creek and the adjacent floodplain areas. And whether you're a 10-year-old child looking to play in the stream, or you're looking to walk your dog, or you're basically just want to appreciate the fact that you've got some native ecology and streams in your neighborhood, that's what we are proud to have achieved here with these partners. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate your attention.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for my presentation. My name is Bill Dooley. I am a policy analyst with the Association of State Wetland Managers, and I am going to be sharing with you some preliminary findings from an Association of State Wetland Managers Wetland Program Development Grant that is focused on improving restoration and protection activities related to urban wetlands specifically. So just to give you a little overview of what you can expect from the presentation today, I'm going to go do a little background, give you a frame of reference where we're approaching this project from, how we reached it. I'm going to go over what the project is, and go into some of the components, the outputs that we're developing as part of it, and then share with you some of the preliminary findings that we've developed from this point, as well as some of the example projects that we're looking at and analyzing as part of the project. And hopefully at the end of that, we'll have about 5 minutes for questions. So it's common practice here at ASFPM. We tend to try to build on prior work and find ways to enhance it and develop it in areas where it's needed. And that's certainly the case here with the Urban Wetlands Project. This really came out of 2 prior wetland program development grants. The first focused on wetland restoration and was designed to identify certain techniques, approaches, frameworks, mindsets, the key variables that really go into developing and resulting in successful wetland restoration projects. And one of the major findings from that project was that successful wetland restoration projects tend to frame the wetland within the context of the larger watershed, seeing wetlands as a component of the watershed and not a unique, separate, removed hydrologic system that's being restored and developed for its own needs, requirements. That dovetailed into the Healthy Wetlands, Healthy Watersheds project, which looked at examples where that was implemented, where wetlands were framed within a larger watershed context, and restoration was occurring or protection was occurring to help attain other plans or needs or goals in a really integrated water management type of approach. And what we found from those projects was that there are real challenges in framing urban wetlands in that larger watershed context due to a number of reasons. Sorry about that, such as the highly altered environment and barriers such as really that are a problem in urban areas, such as local ordinances or land use plans, as well as things that, probably pretty obvious, things like property value and just availability of land for restoration and protection can make that kind of approach more difficult to proceed with than maybe in a rural area. And we see that as a problem because urban wetlands do provide a lot of fantastic services. They may be smaller, they may be more degraded, they may have more invasive species or something to that effect than a rural, pristine wetland. But they still have a lot of value and they still make cities more livable. They still reduce flooding, They still clean the water, and they still provide habitat for plants and animals. In particular, they provide green spaces and outdoor education opportunities to populations that, the rural wetlands maybe don't in the same way. They are more accessible in just their proximity. But despite these values, urban wetlands maybe aren't always fully appreciated. People aren't always aware of those values and the services that they provide. They're often viewed by the public as maybe wastelands, breeding ground for insects or pests, a place to dump trash, or for those urban wetland managers or state wetland managers, land managers, what have you. They may just be seen as too small or too degraded to be worthy of protection and restoration, for the limited resources, budget, time, that the return on investment may not be worth it in an urban area, especially given the way that their plans are designed and measured. So with that in mind, ASWM approached this project, saw this as a need that urban wetlands really need some specific attention on what can be done to improve the protection and restoration of these resources. And in particular, given their proximity to urban communities, the way that it can be done in such a way that maximizes economic, ecological, and social benefits to the communities associated in close proximity to and benefiting from those urban wetlands. And we're coming at the project from 3 specific areas. Kind of just broadly speaking, we're calling one of them about policy, looking at how state wetland program plans can be better designed to provide support to urban wetlands, and how the EPA's core element framework, which provides kind of like an outline for those state wetland program plans, how that can be maybe some recommendations that might improve the way that it supports the state plans and how those interact with urban wetlands. The other one is how integrated and functional mapping prioritization tools can play an integral part in urban wetland restoration success or protection, in just supporting land use decisions and finding the wetlands that are going to have the biggest support for whatever goal it is that you have in mind, and finding examples where that has been utilized or implemented in a positive way. And the final area that we're kind of looking at this is funding. How do we get these projects funded? Are there any funding mechanisms that are perhaps being underutilized? Are there long-term funding mechanisms that have been used in areas that we can talk about or highlight? What are the difficulties with accessing this funding? We want to kind of better understand how we can support urban wetland managers in financially supporting the restoration and protection of the resources as well. And in doing so, we have a few different outputs that we're working on, which I'm going to go into a little bit. We're developing a series of webinars. We have integrated functional mapping workshops, and we are developing a guide for urban wetland restoration and protection. And all this material is available on the ASWM website. So, perfect. All right. So one of those components I talked about is the webinar series. We have 6 webinars that are being hosted via the Natural Floodplains Functions Alliance. If you're not aware of that, NFFA is an affiliation of nonprofit and private organizations, government agencies, individuals, and that are dedicated to protection and preservation of natural floodplains. So, and obviously a good fit for the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and ASFPM is actually heavily involved in NFFA. And the goal of the webinar is to really showcase innovative approaches, successful strategies, and other techniques that employ wetland restoration and nature-based solutions to improve urban economic, ecological, and social health. We've hosted 5 of the 6. Those are available on ASWM's website. We have 1 more to go, which I'm really kind of hoping to showcase some examples from the guide or from this project, from this grant. or maybe highlight some of the big findings from the guide that will likely be coming late summer or early fall, something like that. But if you're not already familiar with NFFA webinars, it's a great backlog of them. It's not just these 6, and I would recommend checking them out if you haven't already. We also have an integrated mapping workshop series. This actually started prior to this grant. There was one workshop that was the first one, and 2 and 3 were to be funded by this urban wetlands grant. The workshop series has an overall goal of supporting the integration of wetland and riparian mapping techniques and data to assess floodplain function and better inform land use decisions. It's supported by NFFA, that group I just mentioned, as well as the Wetland Mapping Consortium, which is another group that ASFPM is heavily involved with, and there's a separate webinar series on that. The workshop is also supported by the Association of State Floodplain Managers as well. That first workshop that was preceded this grant was really set up to highlight the need and develop a roadmap for the future workshops. The second one, which was the first one that was funded by this grant, was held in September 2019. It focused on technical needs and data gaps for this integrated and functional assessment. And was really concentrated on how data and scale drive policy. From the coarser remote sensing, national, regional level, down to field surveys and design level modeling and mapping. The workshop highlighted how cooperation among different levels of government really helps support goals at each level, and that priority functions are typically those that are related to human health and well-being. It also highlighted that there's a need for better data at all levels. When you're talking about data gaps, it kind of runs the spectrum. Updated NWI maps and FEMA maps from the federal level. Market value of ecosystem services at the local level is critically needed, as well as better hydrologic data across the board at all levels. And finally, there's also the assessment that there's a need for common naming conventions among federal agencies. Pause. There was to be a second from the grant and third in the series workshop funded by this grant that was going to focus on policy and program changes. Unfortunately, that was going to be hosted in October this year, 2020, and obviously given the circumstances, that has been postponed. We're going to hold that in 2021 just because, shoot. Let me pause. How did this happen? Oh, that's right. There was supposed to be a third workshop in the series, second under the grant that was going to be funded through as part of this urban wetlands project that was going to focus on policy and program changes. Fortunately, given the circumstances, that was going to be in October 2020. We're postponing that until 2021. That work really necessitates that in-person experience for collaboration and sharing. We just didn't feel like we were going to be able to accomplish the goals that we have remaining within a virtual experience. We're planning on having some kind of a virtual meeting to kind of maintain momentum and maybe address some of those things that we missed in the last one and prepare us better for 2021. But we're going to hold off on that third and final workshop, which is going to develop final recommendations and a final report until 2021. Another, not necessarily output, but an important part of the project is we've pulled together a nationally representative work group to help inform on tasks and findings from the project. We've really worked to try and have it represent a wide swath of the country, state, local, federal government levels, NPOs, academia, as much as we can, the whole spectrum that would be interested and involved in urban wetlands. And this group is really heavily involved. They've identified some of the major issues that we're discussing and some of the findings that I'm going to share with you in a moment. And they're provided insight on example projects or funding mechanisms. They've been a huge help. they're really their main goal is going to be involved more in the guide that I can actually get into right now. So the strategic guide, the wetland restoration, urban wetland restoration protection guide, strategic guide is probably the main output from this this grant, as far as I see it. And the goal of the guide is to support future efforts to improve policies, programs, and actions that protect and restore urban wetlands. And we're planning on focusing on those three areas I talked about before: the policy from the state end of how state wetland program plans can better support urban wetlands, the prioritization mapping tools and the role that they can play, and the funding. And we are focusing on example projects where those have been implemented in such a way that is worth highlighting. They've employed some kind of unique funding approach apparatus, or they've used a really great GIS tool that helped them evaluate and assess their local wetland resources, or they have some good insight or partnership with the state that was worth developing and looking at and analyzing more. And from that, we're looking to understand better the barriers and challenges that they face, some of the lessons learned that they've come away from this with, and then sharing those in a roadmap and developing a roadmap within that guide so that they can we can help replicate those successful projects elsewhere in areas that are just starting to approach urban wetland project, or maybe are interested in rehashing something that they had done before. Within that guide, we're hoping to have a list of existing resources, recommendations for the core element frameworks. It's hopefully going to be a pretty robust and useful tool for urban wetland managers going forward. So that's all the project components, and want to get into some of the preliminary findings we have at this point. As I think I've mentioned before, the project's it's not done yet. We're scheduled to be done or wrap it up in December, so we still have a little bit of time. We are a little behind where I was hoping we'd be when I first submitted to present on this for the conference, but still absolutely have some things that I want to share with the group and anyone tuning in today. So one of the major things that the work group has come to kind of we've developed or shared based on discussions is that the metrics and goals that are associated with state level wetland program plans really just don't align well with the reality of urban wetlands. Wetland program plans tend to be focused on restoring and protecting wetlands that are large, well-connected hydrologically, provide a wide array of services. They're very healthy, home to unique or important species, plant and animal habitat. And those are all very important, laudable goals. I don't want to detract from that at all. But when you look at a wetland and assess it based on those metrics, an urban wetland in a lot of circumstances just doesn't measure well, which is why we end up with state wetland program plans really not providing the level of support to those smaller but still functionally important wetlands in the way that they would in a rural area. And because of that, it really ends up being local wetland managers or local land managers that are trying to manage these resources or are responsible for managing these resources, even if they aren't necessarily equipped to do so. Another kind of important finding that we've developed from the project is that successful projects are frequently tied or focus on the functional value related to human health and well-being. So it's not, restoration for restoration's sake. It's not because it's gonna have a huge impact on nutrient reduction impact or something like that. It typically urban wetlands are being managed for stormwater because they support stormwater management goals, or because they help reduce localized flooding, or improve storm surge protection to something to those degree. Another factor, though, that is a big variable or driving force in a lot of these is just the access to green space for recreation and educational opportunities. That's another big component of human health and well-being. And again, like I mentioned before, due to their proximity to the populations, large population centers, urban wetlands provide a great opportunity for that. And often when they talk about why a project was, why they focused on that, it was because of that ability to provide those kinds of resources to those areas. And finally, well, I don't want to say finally, I have a few on there, but maybe the last one that I'm going to hit on today, one of the big ones, is just that there is significant opportunity in an urban area for coordination with other programs. Kind of like what we talked about with the Healthy Wetlands, Healthy Watershed, but tends to be more on the local level. And with the number of stakeholders that exist in urban areas, it is may perhaps even more important than elsewhere to incorporate those and coordinate with other programs. They can provide other avenues of funding and support that you just can't get on your own. If you're, again, just focused on restoration for the sake of restoration, or for just the sake of improving animal or plant habitat or something along those lines. And stormwater management is one of those ones that we see pop up frequently, where wetlands are being restored or enhanced to support and improve stormwater management programs. But they're also being addressed for a number of other reasons as well. I've obviously listed a few more of the findings that we've talked about, and I'd be happy to address those maybe in the questions and answer if you want to follow up. I don't really have time to hit on all those today. So, okay, so those are the big findings. So some of the example projects, and I'll just say that we haven't decided definitively, that these are all definitely going to be in the guide, but with the research that we've done so far, the analysis that we've done so far, these 5 here definitely stand out to me as really interesting or exemplary projects that are worth highlighting when you're talking about urban wetland restoration and protection. So I've got the New York City Mitigation Bank, Wetland Mitigation Bank, the San Francisco Bay Parcel Tax, Lake County, that's Lake County, Illinois, Wetland Restoration and Preservation Guide, the White Oak Bayou Wetland Program Plan in Arkansas, and the Atlanta Environmental Impact Bond. And all these projects and all the projects we're really looking at, like I'd mentioned before, try to highlight either a novel funding mechanism, implementation of some really great prioritization tool that supported the wetland management, or something that where they're focusing on how the wetland can coordinate and support other goals and needs within that urban community, and support the three economic, ecological, or social benefits for supporting or benefiting the urban area. So I obviously don't have a lot of time to get into super fine detail on any of these. The NYC Mitigation Bank is fantastic. Really, really fascinating case study. There's a lot online about it, but it's really the EDC, NYC EDC pursued the project primarily to support infrastructure projects, not necessarily for the human health and well-being component. But the value that it provided was recognized and fit well with city resiliency plans following Hurricane Sandy, particularly related to storm surge protection. So they kind of go hand in hand in this one. EDC, the Economic Development Corporation, is uniquely funded to take on the high upfront cost that was associated with setting up this mitigation bank, due to the fact that they have a pretty consistent revenue stream that can support the long and somewhat expensive planning process that went into it. that other local agencies or organizations might have trouble with. But the selling of mitigation credits is going to provide a long-term funding mechanism that is really critical for ongoing restoration and protection and monitoring of urban wetlands in this New York area. The San Francisco Bay parcel tax, another great one, 2016 ballot measure that was passed that proposed a 20-year, $12 parcel tax to fund restoration projects in the Bay that would raise approximately $25 million annually for a wide array of, how they can support projects. They have a number of really great projects underway. The ballot measure passed with wide support, largely because they had this measure in mind kind of early on for a number of years, and they were doing polling and kind of waiting for their time to strike, so to say. And then they used a wide network to, the typical ballot measure outreach campaign that you would see. Again, this is going to support long-term funding of restoration projects. The downside to this is maybe it's not so great on monitoring and assessment, and could better improve support staff for the project. But there's a lot of wonderful urban wetland projects coming out of this, like the San Leandro treatment wetland, similar in some degree to the Tre Rio project that some of you may be aware of. I'm not going to have time to go over all these, but I want to just mention the Lake County Wetland Restoration and Preservation Plan, a great example of wetlands being tied into Stormwater Commission, their goals and desires. They developed a wetland restoration, GIS mapping prioritization tool to better understand the functional capacity uplift of potential wetlands, historic wetlands, to try and focus on which wetlands provide the most services that need the greatest protection, areas that could potentially provide the most uplift in terms of stormwater management, and are using that tool now to support their stormwater goals and also simultaneously protect these urban wetlands within that county. It's a really fascinating project. I would also highly recommend looking into the White Oak Bayou Wetland Program Plan, as well as the Atlanta Environmental Impact Bond. Both are really interesting projects. I think that they will, all of these will end up in our guide, but I can't say that for certain yet. That is basically my time. I want to leave some time for Q&A. So if you have any specific questions, please feel free to follow up. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation.